Can you talk about the founding of the Abbey, how this happened and why?
Okay. I was among the first generation of Westerners to ordain in the Tibetan tradition, and the Tibetans are a refugee population, at least our teachers are, because it's so difficult to go into Tibet and study there. And so there were not facilities for us in Asia to stay in, and there's not facilities in the West. And our Tibetan teachers are very concerned about reestablishing their own Tibetan monasteries in exile. So we Western monastics were kind of left to fend for ourselves. And so there weren't monasteries for us to stay in. There wasn't financial support. It was really quite difficult. You know, I ordained in 1977, so it was a long time ago, and it was really very challenging. And so I feel that community life is very important for our own personal practice. The Buddha established a community, and living in community really helps you with your Dharma practice, applying the teachings. So I just said, well, somebody's going to have to start a monastery. Might as well be me. And so I think a monastery is important, first of all, so that the monastics have a place to practice, but second of all, for the benefit of the Buddha Dharma, because historically it's been the monastic community that has held the teachings and passed them on to a future generation. Now, you might say, well, why is that necessary? There's so many lay practitioners, especially in the West. There's many excellent lay practitioners. Even in Asia there are. Why do we need monastics nowadays? Well, again, if there's a monastery, you have a physical place where people know that Dharma is being practiced. And I've had many people tell me that just knowing that we're here helps their mind, because they know that there's a place where they can go to be with people who are practicing or trying to practice full-time. Okay, they know that there's a physical place where there's a repository for scriptures, where there's going to be retreats, where there's the community that's living the Dharma. So that, the physical place is very important, where the people live, not just a center where people come from time to time, but a community that's actually living it. And then second of all, for people to have that example of people who are outside the mainstream middle-class America, because the Buddha emphasized renunciation so much, you know, and of course it's the mind that is renunciation, because you can abandon your physical things but still have a mind that's very attached. But let's face it, at our basic level, most of us, when we're with the objects of attachment, we indulge. And so having people who are really trying to live a simple lifestyle, who, you know, we don't have you know, a personal house or a personal car or personal computers or whatever, you know, and we have the precepts that limit what we can have, where we can go, what we can do. So it really makes you deal with your mind in a very special way that's different than the way a lay teacher, people who are really practicing non-attachment, you know, who don't have a family, who don't have a career and a job, who don't get paid, but who work very hard, okay? And so I think showing that example of that lifestyle is very, very important, because I think really practicing Buddhist teaching has got to have an effect on our lifestyle, yeah? I mean, because it affects the mind, so it's going to affect how we live in the world. Okay? So I think monasteries are quite important to really hold the teachings and pass the teachings on to future generations, and to be places where everybody can come, but where people who really want to devote their lives to practice have a supportive environment. because out in the middle of the city, it's very difficult, you know? I mean, that's why I ordained, because I knew if I continued working at my job and in my marriage and with my flat and all the possessions, you know, there's no time to practice. Yeah, if I had a family, I couldn't go around and teach different places.
So are you saying that for Buddhism to really take root in America, it needs the monastic aspect?
Yes. Yes, I think the monastic aspect is very important. I think we need many different lifestyles. We need many different Buddhist traditions, because one thing is not suitable for everybody, but we have to make sure that we include everything. And I think the monastic element is crucially important, because we have to remember that our teacher, Lord Buddha, was a monastic. And if we forget that, then we're losing something about the Buddha's own example of how to live and practice.
You have this strong tradition that you've worked hard to bring here, and then you have the American culture, American student. So how do you deal with maintaining the tradition but being appropriate to or successful with people who are in this culture?
Okay, so how do you remain loyal to the tradition and also adapt it for the culture?
Especially from a practice point of view.
Yeah. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the teachings, there's nothing to change in the teachings, because the Buddha was an enlightened being. If I start thinking that I know better than the Buddha, we're in big trouble. Okay? How can I be one of Buddha's followers if I want to teach something different than what the Buddha taught? Okay? So I think it's very important to keep the teachings exactly as they are, and not just pick and choose what we like and don't like and say, well, the Buddha said that, but he really meant this, which is the opposite of what he said. I think we have to remain loyal to the traditional teachings. But in terms of the form and the way a community is organized, or the way the precepts are kept in a certain culture, you know, these more external elements, those are where I feel the adaptation occurs. Okay? So for example, here we do our chanting in English. Okay? And we're making up some of our own melodies. In terms of keeping the monastic precepts, while some of them are difficult to keep exactly per the letter, because the situation is so much different here than it was in India 26 centuries ago, then we look at the precepts and what was the reason that the Buddha spoke that precept, what mental state was he trying to get at, and then we apply that to where we are now. And in addition, there's many situations now that we don't have traditional monastic precepts on, because there was no internet and there were no cell phones, you know, and there were no cars when the Buddha was alive. But now we need guidelines for how to handle those things. And I'm sure if the Buddha were alive, we would have precepts about recycling, about reducing consumption, about you know, restricting our internet use, restricting our cell phone use. Whether we'd even have cell phones or not, I don't know, because I think they can be very disruptive if you're trying to practice. So I think we need to take a lot of the principles that the Buddha had, you know, and bring them and apply them into the situation we face right now. And, you know, so that we have rules of our monastery that are guidelines for how we practice here.
Talking about precepts, have you seen the modern version that Thich Nhat Hanh put together?
I've seen it. I haven't read the whole thing, though. Yeah. So it's a touchy thing, because I think it's important that we really keep the traditional precepts, because you would need a whole monastic gathering to change them. Okay, and that's highly unlikely, but I think we need to keep them. But then in our own monasteries, we need to adapt how we keep them, I think. Okay. But in terms of what practice is transforming our mind. So practice isn't something that you see with your eyes. Yeah, sitting in meditation, that is an aid to practice. Saying mantra is an aid to practice. Wearing robes is an aid to practice. Okay, doing walking meditation is an aid to practice. But real practice is eliminating the ignorance, anger, and selfishness and attachment in our own mind stream. That's what real practice is. Otherwise, we can have lots of, jazzy looking things, but the mind doesn't change at all.
How does it change?
How does it change? Through really applying the teachings to our own life. By really thinking about the teachings the Buddha gave and applying them, looking at our own mind, and is the way my mind is thinking correspond with what the Buddha's teachings? And if it doesn't, then the Buddha taught many ways on how to transform my mind, how to change my attitude, how to tame the ignorance, anger, and attachment. So I need to practice those in my daily life in order to transform my mind. And that's real practice.
When you talk about teachings, one of the big ones that comes to mind for the West is rebirth. Mm-hmm. Need I say more?
Yeah. I have a little list of things that are Buddhist things that are difficult for Westerners, and that's one of the top 10.
Why do you think, and how do you deal with it?
Okay, well, I think that it's such a problem for Westerners because it's not in our culture, first of all. And second of all, because the way our mind thinks, we are so attached to this body and our present ego identity that we think this is all there is. When we say I, we think this body, this mind, this whole ego identity that I've constructed for myself, that is how I present myself to the world. I am this race, I am this nationality, I am this socioeconomic class, I am this, gender, I like this kind of food, I am this political party. We create such a strong identity for ourselves, and we think that that's fixed and permanent, and that's all there is. And that is itself the self-grasping ignorance that is the root of samsara. Okay? In full-blown effect. And so that own ignorance, which has perpetuated rebirth time after time, is the whole thing that prevents us from even understanding that rebirth exists. Because we're so fixed to, well, this is all I am. Yeah? And, it's hard for us to even imagine being a baby or being 90 years old, because we're so fixed with the ego identity of this body. But think, can you even imagine, how was your mind when you were 2 days old? What was going on in your mind? And when you're 90 years old and you have Alzheimer's or dementia, what's going on in your mind? Are you the exact same person? No. Our aggregates, the body and mind, are changing constantly. When we understand change, and we understand that there's no fixed person, then it makes understanding rebirth very easy, because we see that there's just momentary conditioning. Yeah? And so the mind stream goes on, and it's not a person, and it's not an inherently existent entity.
So are Westerners embracing rebirth, or are they putting it aside for a later day?
It depends upon the people, okay? Some Buddhist traditions stress it more than others. So clearly the ones in which it's stressed, the people are dealing with it more. I usually tell people at the very beginning, initially, like, learn the Dharma teachings and use what helps you right now and use what makes sense to you. And if something like rebirth doesn't make sense, put it on the back burner. But don't criticize it, and don't say the Buddha didn't teach it, and don't say it's not important. Just say, I don't understand it. But later, as you're practicing what does help you and what does make sense, then come back and think about rebirth from time to time and see if over some time it starts making more sense.
What those were, but maybe it might be more interesting to ask you, what are the things that come easier to Westerners? Do you have some things that they just seem to get, or they're strong at from the beginning?
I think what I've seen people really appreciate is the teachings in Buddhism that teach us how to work with our emotions. Okay? So in the Tibetan tradition, for example, there's a whole series of teachings called thought training. And so much of that is about how to transform adversity into the path, how to work with anger, how to work with clinging attachment and dissatisfaction and those things. So those teachings people in the West really like, okay? I think the mindfulness practice is also something very helpful for people because it gets them in touch with their own experience, because people are usually so busy running around that they don't know who they are. They're out of touch with their experience. So I think mindfulness is very helpful in that way. And then after that, you find people really have different dispositions and aptitudes. Like some people, they love the ritual in Buddhism. Other people don't like ritual. Or some people like this ritual, but they don't like that ritual. But it's interesting, the ritual they like, they don't consider ritual. But the ritual they don't like, they consider, I don't like this ritual. Too much ritual. Right. So we're very funny. Because if we look in our lives are full of ritual, aren't they? We get up in the morning and we have our own little morning ritual, what we do every day. Yeah? So, and our lives are just one ritual, going to work is a ritual. Yeah? Another thing I think that people have really appreciated is the emphasis on checking what your motivation is. In other words, what is my intention for doing what I'm doing? Not how do I look in front of others, and are they going to approve of me, and will I have a good reputation? Because we know how to make ourselves look good and do all the fluff. We know that. We're very good at that. But what we really need to do is look inside here, and what really is my motivation for doing what I'm doing? And what really is the purpose and meaning of my life?
And when they do that, self-help, if you go to the bookstore, there are endless self-help books. Yeah. And that's a whole other thing. But are we using Buddhism like that, or are we using it as it is, do you think?
Well, Buddhism can be used both ways. Some people use it as self-help. And I think that's fine and it's beneficial. But I also think that's limited, because that helps people psychologically okay? But we have to move beyond the psychology and the thing of making this life a little bit better and really adapt the broader Buddhist worldview. And I think that's incredibly important in order to be a long-term serious practitioner who calls themselves a Buddhist. Okay? So why rebirth and these kinds of things are not, essential at the beginning, if you're going to really practice in depth, I think understanding the Buddhist worldview and really embracing it is important, because if you don't, then some of those other meditations just don't make sense. Okay? So, I think that long-term vision of aiming for liberation, aiming for full enlightenment, that's crucial in order to be a Buddhist, in order to practice the full extent of what Buddha Shakyamuni taught.
But to be an American means you have to have gotten it yesterday.
And so maybe some of our American culture needs to settle down, and we need to get rid of this push-button approach. Somebody asked His Holiness the Dalai Lama a few years ago, how can I get enlightened as quickly as possible? And His Holiness just stopped, and his eyes filled with tears. And he said, that's not the right question to ask. Because it's not a thing of hurry up and get it done. It's a thing of creating the causes over a long period of time. And so I think that is one of the biggest hindrances we Westerners have for practice, is we want everything immediately. Yeah. But when you think that our mind has been full of ignorance, anger, and attachment and selfishness since beginningless time, to think that we're going to change all these habits in a week or a month or a few years and make them totally non-existent, that's too high of expectation. Of course, if we practice, those habits will change gradually, but to really uproot them so that they never occur again, that's going to take a lot of time and really, very prolonged mental training. Yeah.
A little while ago you mentioned psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ask you about that relationship, but people often go to psychotherapists for extended periods of time.
Yeah.
based on what I don't know. But culturally we feel it's an extended period of time.
Right.
But what is the relationship between Buddhism and psychology in America? You brought it up.
Okay. So. Okay. First of all, I think there's many overlaps, but I also think they're two distinct disciplines. Okay? Psychology is aimed at helping you live a better life this life. Okay? Buddhism is helping you get out of the cycle of existence altogether. So they have two very different goals. Making this life more harmonious and better relationships is a very good goal. But getting out of the cycle of existence altogether is a much greater, more expansive goal. And that's that long-term vision that makes it a spiritual practice. Of course, in getting yourself out of samsara, you have to deal with many of your psychological issues. Okay? Then, so in terms of their goal, it's different. In terms of the methodology, it's also different. When you see a therapist, it's usually one-on-one, or maybe a small group, and you talk about your story. and you talk about your feelings and your story and your childhood and how people react, how they treated you as a child and how you reacted, and you express all these emotions. What was so interesting for me in Buddhism is my teachers were not interested at all in my story. You know, I was so attached to my story, and I wanted to hear my Tibetan teachers, you know. And first of all, they teach in a group, so I can't tell my story in a group because my teachers are teaching all the time, you know. And when I go see them individually, they aren't interested in my story. They want to know, you know, what are the mental states that I'm having trouble with, and then they'll help me deal with those mental states. Yeah? So sometimes in that, you have to talk a little bit about your story. And I find with my, you know, the people I help, that, you know, sometimes they will tell me their parts of their story. But I also have to help them get over identifying with that story. Because we cling to that story. We create an identity out of it. Whatever our story was, that identity is part of the self-grasping ignorance that keeps us bound in cyclic existence. You know? And somehow we can, you know, get really into it, even to the extent where we start psychologizing on the meditation cushion. You know? And so then, instead of actually doing the practice that the teacher's teaching, we start thinking about our childhood and this and that and the inner child and all these kinds of things. And I actually think that if somebody has a lot of those issues, psychologists are trained to help with that. And they should go to a psychologist for that. Buddhist practice can be helpful and be an adjunct, but psychology has more specialization in that. And I think, you know, they should use the expertise of the therapists. Yeah.
So these two disciplines are not for merging, in your estimation?
I don't think they should merge. I think there's some overlap. I think there's some areas where they can help each other and complement each other, but I think it's very important that they're kept separate. Yeah? Because otherwise, you know, to make Buddhism more acceptable to everybody, then we drop the Buddhist worldview. Okay? Which means we stop challenging the whole identity of I and self. If we stop challenging that, then there's no way to free ourselves from the ignorance that binds us in samsara. There's no way to realize the emptiness of inherent existence. You know, there's no way to see the ultimate truth. Okay?
teacher-student relationship. What happens, particularly here, but in general, what do you?
Well, that, I was telling you about my list of things Westerners find difficult. That's up there. That's also one of the top 10. Because Westerners hear this thing of, guru devotion and surrender to your guru, and they get this very funny kind of mind. And instead of surrendering their ego and their ignorance and their selfishness, they surrender their wisdom. And that's poison. So I think how to relate to a spiritual mentor is one of those things that really is not understood very well in the Western culture. Because many times, the Asian teachers are teaching within an Asian culture where people understand what the student-teacher relationship is. Westerners, we don't have that history. So if an Asian teacher comes here and is teaching the way or giving the description of the relationship the way it was in Asia, people here misunderstand it. And we start to think, oh, I stop thinking, I listen to what the teacher says, and I just do that, and that's it. And that's not it, The Buddha really emphasized we need to be intelligent, we need to be thoughtful, we need to think about things, we need to follow ethical conduct, and if a teacher teaches you to do something that is not ethical, you have every right and every need to say no, And so I think the relationship is about developing wisdom, not about becoming a groupie, and not about having your spiritual teacher be mommy or daddy. And I say this because at the beginning of my practice, and I only realized this years later, is, I really wanted my spiritual teacher to be the ideal parent that I didn't have. And so I was acting out all my rebelliousness, the whole thing, on my teacher, all my authority issues. Yeah. So I had a lot to work with, to really come around and try and understand what this relationship is all about.
Yeah. So you said it's all about wisdom. That was the closest you came to putting it in one sentence or two.
It's about, you have to trust your own wisdom, and so that means you have to learn to discriminate wisdom from ignorance, which is not easy. Okay, because we will rationalize, justify, and do the whole thing to give our ignorance power. Okay, but we also have to recognize the wisdom that the teacher has. And that's why we select certain people to be our teachers. So not everybody who has the title teacher is a qualified teacher. Even among those who are qualified teachers, not every one of them has to be your teacher. We have to think carefully and really learn the qualities of teachers and then decide who we want to guide us. Yeah, so we really need to do great research about the teacher and not just be blind and like, oh, they have a good reputation, oh, they tell a lot of jokes and teachings, I'll follow them. No, that's foolishness, okay? And so, we look for the qualities of wisdom and compassion and good ethical conduct and meditative experience and, all sorts of, there's a whole list in the scriptures of qualities to look for in a teacher. And we should evaluate, And then we should also, there's a list of qualities that we should develop as students. And we should try and develop those qualities, yeah? Instead of automatically thinking, well, I'm the perfect student, I have nothing to change.
Because I think that's controversial, not only in Buddhism, but all over the place, the idea that people argue about it, and I have an interest in that. You're saying the student has responsibility, even though they're deluded, to start discriminating between wisdom and ignorance. It's their responsibility.
Yeah.
And that's a strong statement, I think.
Yeah. And, you know, we have difficulty discriminating between ignorance and wisdom. So that's why we accept somebody as our teacher, because they can do it better than us. Okay? So we listen to our teacher, but we have to integrate what they teach into our own mind. And we do that not by accepting it blindly, but by testing it and practicing it and thinking about it and seeing if it makes logical sense or not.
Retreats. You have monastics come on retreat here, but you also have lay people.
Right.
I mean, you can describe your retreats if you like, that would be fine. But my question is, how important are retreats, especially for lay people, but also monastics?
Okay.
And what's the point?
What's the point of a retreat?
Right.
Okay. A retreat, you have to ask, what are we retreating from? We're retreating from ignorance, anger, attachment, and self-centered mind. Okay? That's what we're really retreating from. Now, to do that, we have to set up an environment that is conducive to help us retreat from our ignorance, anger, attachment, and self-centeredness. Okay? So that's why retreats are structured in a certain way. So for example, the retreats I lead, we keep silence. We have a daily schedule, you know, and everybody's expected to come to the sessions. Yeah, we have a particular practice that we do. We check in with the teacher once in a while about how we're doing on that practice. So the environment is structured in order to help us do the intensive practice that will lead us to lessen our ignorance, anger, attachment, and self-centeredness, and develop love and compassion and generosity and ethical conduct and fortitude and all sorts of good qualities. Okay? What I see in American Buddhism, this is a very broad generality, is for lay people, there are basically two situations available. One is you're living in the city at home with your crazy American life, you know, where you have to work overtime and you have your mortgage payments and you have your kids and everything else, and you try and get to a Buddhist center once or twice a week to hear teachings or to sit. Okay, so that's one opportunity available for lay people. The other opportunity is you go on retreat and you pay your money, and then people totally take care of you. You don't have to cook. Maybe you have to chop a few vegetables and wash the floor. But maybe some retreat centers, if you pay more, you don't even have to do that. You keep silence and you don't do anything but meditate and do what you want to do during the break time. And so those seem to be the two main alternatives for Western lay practitioners. Okay? What a monastery is about is our daily life is somewhere in between those. You know, and this is what we can make available not only for monastics but also for lay people who want to come and participate at Sravasti Abbey. So, for example, we have a strict daily schedule. We have meditation morning and evening. We have teachings. We have study time. We have formal meals. We do recitations and prayers and chanting before meals, after meals, different things for different meals. We have an ethical code of conduct. We offer service. That's what we call work, but we call it offering service because you don't get paid. Yeah, your motivation is to do it to benefit the community, benefit the Buddha Dharma, benefit sentient beings, so that your whole life here, even if you're offering service, is imbued with the Dharma. Okay, and our whole community way of life is imbued with the Dharma. And that's something that I really try and emphasize here. Even your relationships with people, because of course things come up between people. We're all human beings, you know. And so people disagree and they don't like what somebody did, and somebody sleeps in and doesn't come to meditation. And, you know, I mean, everything happens, okay? But we try and help each other because we all know that we're working on our mind together, okay? And so we really focus on helping each other. And so this whole container, which is the Abbey life 24/7, is a very different thing than what is available to lay practitioners, which is either a Dharma center with your crazy life in the city, or retreat where you pay your money and then you can kind of get what you want. Or you're, you know, or you're well taken care of. Yeah. So here, our normal lifestyle is really imbued with the Dharma, and we're serving and we're, you know, doing all sorts of things and studying and teaching and practicing. And then at the Abbey, in the winter for 3 months, we close the Abbey and we just have retreat. And so if there's lay people who want to come join us for retreat, they're very welcome to. But we don't have in and out traffic with people coming as visitors. If you're here to do retreat. And it's wonderful because it snows and it's quiet and you don't want to do anything else but meditate and study. So it's great, you know. And then in the other seasons, we have shorter retreats. You know, you might have a weekend retreat, you might have a week-long retreat, something like that. Those shorter retreats, I usually include more teaching in those than in the 3-month retreat, because in the 3-month retreat, you really want to go deep in your own meditation. And so you have to train before the retreat starts to be prepared to do the retreat. Whereas the shorter retreats, people are coming often just to get a taste of Buddhism or to hear some teachings, do a little bit more intense practice. So those shorter retreats are structured a little bit different. But I insist on silence during all the retreats because I think that's really important for people.
24/7?
Yeah. Well, except sometimes we'll have discussion group. Yeah. And I think that can be very helpful.
So talking is scheduled if it's
yes.
It's on the schedule.
Right.
Sravasti Abbey, the people who are here and who come here, both monastics and lay people, how diverse is that group of people, and how important do you think diversity and inclusiveness are?
Okay. Well, I think diversity and inclusiveness are very, very important, especially for Buddhism to exist in places like America, where it's such a diverse culture. And so I think one thing that's very important is gender equality. So this is a big transition step from the way Buddhism is often practiced in Asia. But the Buddha wanted everybody to get enlightened, and he wanted everybody, so for everybody to get enlightened, everybody needs equal practice opportunities. So I think we need to really open things up in terms of gender inclusiveness. What I'm very pleased about here at Sravasti Abbey is we have a lot of ethnic and racial inclusiveness too. And like I mentioned, you know, I've heard of some Dharma centers because they see most of their people are upper middle class white professionals, you know, and so they feel a need to be more inclusive. But our community has developed in a very, very different way. And, you know, we have some upper middle class white professionals, but not a whole lot. And we have a much bigger cross-section of society. And that's something I really value and I think is very precious. I think part of that comes because I have a very close connection with Asia and with Asians. and I was trained in Asia, and I love Asian culture, and it's very deep in my heart. And so, you know, it's included in here. You know, we're not trying to make everything just American culture. We're trying to include also the good things of Asian culture. And so we haven't had that difficulty. And for example, we have a very good relationship with some Chinese Buddhists who live in various temples around the country. And when we do ordination here, then they will come and help us do the ordination, because you need a certain number of monastics to give the ordination. And so then we have other, Asian lay people who come and take part in our activities. And we have Latinos and blacks coming. And so it's very nice. And some of the people who are here now, we have somebody from Romania, 2 Canadians, somebody from Israel is here now. So we had somebody from France who wanted to come, but then something happened. So, we really, I value the international aspect and the inclusiveness, because I think it's just more ways that we can learn from each other.
When you teach outside of the Abbey, do you feel that personally, the gender equality issue, what do you experience?
What I experience outside the Abbey in terms of the gender equality issue, it varies from place to place. It really varies a lot. Some places I go and I have to stay in back, and and there's no gender equality, and I pick that up from the beginning, and I play that role, because when in Rome you do what the Romans do. I have to be polite and courteous to whoever is hosting me. But then other places, it's very, what's very interesting, when you asked when I go travel, what's very interesting? There's also a reverse kind of racism, where people think that if you are Asian, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, if you are Tibetan, then you must be very holy and realized. But if you were Western, you grew up with Mickey Mouse like me, so you don't know anything. So it's very interesting. Some places sometimes I'll go to different Tibetan centers, and there will be monastics there that are much junior to me, that are not, or whatever, but they're treated with so much reverence. And I'm just, kind of by the way. So it's really very interesting. So as a Western monastic, you have to learn to be extremely flexible, because you never know how people are going to treat you, So you can't have any expectations, because sometimes people will be very respectful, sometimes not at all, sometimes in the middle. It's really very interesting.
I even find that I don't know how to behave here as I travel around, because watching how other people behave with their teachers, whereas in Korea it's very clear what the status of monastics is.
Right.
And most people adhere to that. And so it becomes very ritualized.
Right.
But here, it's often not what I expect, and I often find I don't know what I should be doing.
Right. And you know what? It's often unclear on the side of the teachers too, because of the cultural difference and of finding ways in American culture to show respect without creating a barrier, because there's different ways of showing respect in different cultures. And then there's also the whole thing in America of getting people to wake up and look outside of themselves. And I think that's one of the ways in which respecting our teachers and respecting the Sangha benefits everybody, whether you're lay or Sangha, because we all have to respect our teachers and we all respect the Sangha, is it gets us to look outside of ourselves. Okay? So when you're eating, you notice if your teacher needs more food. You notice if their bowl needs to be washed. You notice if they're sitting in a comfortable place. It makes you look outside yourself, because we are so self-centered that we only look at, well, am I getting the food I want, and am I sitting in the kind of chair I want, and everything like this. So it's very interesting in terms of trying to train Westerners to do that, but without, because Westerners are very sensitive to ego trips and to authority trips, but to get them to see that, no, this isn't ego and authority, it's to help you open your mind to care about other sentient beings. Because that's the core of the Buddha Dharma, is caring about others. Yeah, so you start with your teacher, you start with the Sangha, yeah? And then from there it becomes easier to go out to other people.
When you talk about all of that, but looking outside of yourself, I'm wondering, you must have some students who come here, get some benefit, and start to change, but when they try to take that into the workplace, they find that it conflicts with their ability to be successful or to move up.
People say that to me, that Buddhism, it conflicts with being successful and you can't move up. I think that's rubbish. I think it's total rubbish, because what is Buddhism? Keeping good ethical conduct. If you work in a job and you keep good ethical conduct, your boss is going to trust you.
Yes, you don't. But on the other hand, if you're not the squeaky wheel, if you don't have a bit of an ego trip going, you often don't get noticed and move up.
Well, that's quite okay. Because what happens when you move up? Then you get the pleasure of working 12-hour days and being more stressed out than you were before.
Good point.
Yeah? So I don't see moving up the corporate ladder as a sign of success. I think being an ethical, compassionate individual is a sign of success.
Good. I love it.
Yeah. And if you are honest with your clients are going to come back. If you lie to your clients, they're never going to come back and do business with you, because they're obviously going to find out that you've been lying.
So mainstream corporate America and Buddhism are compatible.
I think so. I think so.
Maybe.
And I think if you bring compassion into business, people are going to work so much better. And if you take care of the people in the workplace instead of just pushing, they're going to work much better. And if you create a vision that is worthwhile for the people besides making money, then the workers will work so much better. Because when everybody just has the vision of money as the standard of success, then they're only going to work for themselves to get more money for themselves. They're not even caring about the money or they only care about the profit of the company because it means they get something. So that kind of motivation is not going to last long term. And the employees won't be stable. You're going to have a lot of disharmony. But if you give people a vision of, we're working at this corporation to serve society. Yeah, we want to make good products that serve society, and we want to treat society fairly. We want to take care of the environment. We want to take care of our customers and of the people who work for us. And you present that kind of vision of a company, people will get excited about that. Because it's a vision that brings them outside of themselves. And they can feel like, I'm doing something that benefits other living beings. And that's what we all need as a motivation that makes us excited about life. And I think that's one of the reasons we have so much depression nowadays, is because people only have such a narrow vision of success. Money, status, fame, sex. it's so limited, it's so self-centered. You get all that and you're still miserable. So if we teach a vision of success and joy being when you benefit others, whether you know those others or don't know those others, then people's minds enlarge, they aren't as depressed, they get along better with others, they're excited about life.
It's not just a fantasy, it can happen in the real world.
I think so.